In the opulent halls of the Whitaker mansion, Celia Tanner is an invisible force, a maid with a quiet presence and a hidden past. She watches Gregory Whitaker, a successful businessman, devoted husband, and, unbeknownst to him, her lost son. The only trace of their bond is a familiar birthmark that brings Celia to the edge of revelation. As she endures the cold scorn of Gregory's wife, Mariah, Celia must decide: stay silent and protect Gregory's carefully crafted life, or reveal the truth, shattering the illusions surrounding his family. But secrets buried too long have a way of surfacing, and with Mariah's relentless cruelty driving her closer to breaking, Celia finds herself on the brink of a confrontation that will change everything. Hidden roots, once unearthed, will either tear this family apart or bring them together in ways they never imagined. Celia Tanner moved silently through the Whitaker mansion as dawn broke, her soft footsteps masked by the grand silence of the halls. In Gregory's office, she began dusting shelves lined with books and family photos. One picture caught her eye, a young Gregory with his adoptive parents, their smiles as bright as his. Celia felt a pull in her chest, a strange connection to him she couldn't explain. She shook her head, chastising herself. "It's silly," she murmured, "just a daydream." Yet, as she dusted the frame, she couldn't ignore the familiar ache in her heart, a reminder of the son she'd lost long ago. As Celia entered the kitchen to prepare breakfast, Mariah stormed in, her heels clicking with purpose. "Celia, don't just stand there. Coffee, now," Mariah ordered, her tone sharp. Celia quietly moved to fill the cup, but Mariah's irritation boiled over, her hand catching the edge of the cup and spilling it onto Celia's hand. Mariah hardly noticed. "Watch what you're doing, would you?" she said, brushing past. Celia cleaned up the spill, her face calm, but her thoughts swirled with resentment. "Is that all I am to her?" she whispered, bitterness creeping into her heart. Celia busied herself in the sitting room, carefully arranging flowers. Gregory walked through, heading out for work, and she paused, catching sight of his arm. The birthmark on his forearm, the familiar shape, made her freeze. Her mind flashed back to the infant son she'd lost, who'd had the same mark. A tremor passed through her. "Could it?" she murmured, but quickly shook herself. Gregory caught her staring, and she looked down, embarrassed. "Good morning, Celia," he said warmly. She nodded, her voice a whisper. "Good morning, sir." That evening, the mansion was filled with the chatter of guests. Mariah had organized one of her grand soirees, where friends gathered to admire her home. Celia moved among them, serving drinks, enduring the occasional dismissive remark. As she passed Mariah, she overheard, "She's a bit clumsy, isn't she?" Mariah's voice, dripping with derision, stung Celia. But Gregory, catching the exchange, stepped in. "Mariah," he said softly, "Celia does a fine job. Let's enjoy the evening, shall we?" Celia felt a brief flicker of gratitude, but her heart ached knowing Gregory didn't see her for who she truly was. After the guests had gone, Celia was left to clean up the remnants of the evening alone. Weary, she moved to Gregory's office, drawn to a photo album he'd left open on his desk. As she flipped through it, she came across a picture of him as a young boy. The resemblance to her memories of her son left her breathless. She touched the image, her hand trembling. "Could you be?" she whispered. The possibility gnawed at her, filling her with both hope and fear. She knew she had to find out, no matter the cost. Celia lay awake in her modest quarters, memories of her lost son flashing through her mind. In the quiet of dawn, she recalled every desperate search and every sleepless night. Now, with Gregory so close, the past felt more alive than ever. Her resolve strengthened as she whispered, "I have to know." Throughout the day, she found herself observing Gregory more closely, looking for any signs, small gestures or habits that might confirm her suspicions. Celia caught another maid, Ruth, in the hallway and decided to tread carefully. "Ruth," she began, keeping her tone casual, "do you know much about Mr. Whitaker's family?" Ruth raised an eyebrow, curious. "Well, I've heard he was adopted. Mrs. Whitaker never talks about it, though." Celia nodded, feeling a surge of hope. "Adopted, you say?" Ruth shrugged. That's the rumor. Came to them as a baby. Celia's heart pounded, but she kept her face calm. Thank you, Ruth, she said quietly, her mind racing with this new piece of information. Later, while dusting near Gregory's office, Celia overheard him on the phone with his adoptive parents, Richard and Vivian. Yes, I understand, he said, his voice warm but firm. We'll visit soon. Celia's hands stilled as she strained to hear more, wondering about the family she once dreamed would raise her child. Could Richard and Vivian be the ones who had taken him in? The idea felt surreal, almost impossible. Still, it filled her with a strange sense of gratitude mingled with longing. While polishing silverware, Celia felt a shadow fall over her. She looked up to find Mariah, arms crossed and gaze piercing. You seem distracted, Celia, Mariah noted, her tone icy. Be careful not to overstep. Celia's face remained neutral, though her heart pounded. I understand, Mrs. Whitaker. Mariah's lips curved into a smirk. Good. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings now, would we? As Mariah walked away, Celia felt her own determination harden. She knew she had to tread carefully, but nothing could deter her from seeking the truth. That evening, Celia found herself lingering near Gregory's office. She studied the shelves, pretending to arrange a few books. Gregory walked in and noticed her, giving her a kind smile. Everything all right, Celia? He asked gently. She nodded, her heart aching. Yes, Mr. Whitaker. I just wanted to make sure everything was in place. Gregory looked at her, a glint of warmth in his eyes. You've always kept this place in perfect order, Celia. Thank you. His words resonated, filling her with a painful longing. Once he left, she made a quiet vow. I'll find a way, my son, she whispered to the empty room, ready to uncover the full truth. Celia gathered her courage as she approached Vivian, Gregory's adoptive mother, during her afternoon tea in the garden. Mrs. Whitaker, she began, carefully choosing her words, I was wondering if you might share some of Gregory's story with me. He's an admirable man. Vivian looked at her curiously, lowering her teacup. Why the sudden interest, Celia? Celia hesitated, but managed. Just admiration is all. Vivian smiled warmly. He's always been special, our Gregory. He was adopted as a baby. Celia's heart skipped, but she held her composure. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker, she replied, her voice steady, even as her mind raced. After her conversation with Vivian, Celia knew she needed more concrete proof. She searched old records, hoping to find any trace of her lost son's adoption, but met dead ends. Frustration grew, yet determination pushed her forward. It's like he vanished into thin air, she murmured, sifting through documents. Still, she refused to give up, each failed attempt only deepening her resolve. Celia knew the answers were somewhere, perhaps closer than she realized. She whispered, I will find you, Gregory. I will. The following evening, Celia lingered in Gregory's office, pretending to dust. Gregory entered unexpectedly, catching her with a family album in hand. Celia, he said, surprised, you seem interested in my family history. She hesitated, then offered a gentle smile. Your family has built a beautiful legacy, she replied. Gregory softened, seeming touched. Sometimes I wonder about my roots, he admitted. Who I might have been. His words struck her heart. You're a good man, she said, her voice filled with unspoken love, and turned quickly, hiding her tears. As Celia left the office, she encountered Mariah, who eyed her suspiciously. You've been spending an awful lot of time around Gregory's things, Mariah noted coldly. I hope you aren't getting too comfortable. Celia met her gaze calmly. I'm only doing my job, Mrs. Whitaker. Mariah leaned closer. Well, remember your place. My husband doesn't need any distractions. Celia's hands clenched, but she nodded. Of course, Mrs. Whitaker, she murmured, though a fire burned within her. Mariah's words only strengthened her resolve to uncover the truth. Late that night, unable to sleep, Celia ventured into the mansion's quiet study. She searched the archives, determined to find something more concrete. Finally, she stumbled upon a record of Gregory's adoption, but with details omitted, an oddity she couldn't ignore. Her hand shook as she traced the paper. "This is it," she whispered, hope and fear intertwining. Now certain, she knew she had to confront Gregory. The truth was no longer a possibility. It was a reality she had to face. Celia took a deep breath, bracing herself outside Gregory's office. Her hands trembled as she knocked, her heart pounding. "Come in," Gregory called. She entered, her gaze steady yet vulnerable. "Mr. Whitaker, I have something very important to tell you." He looked up, curious. "Of course, Celia. Go on." Celia hesitated, the weight of her words almost too much to bear. I believe you are my son," she said, her voice trembling. Gregory's face paled. "What are you talking about?" he asked, shock flooding his voice. Gregory stared at Celia, the room suddenly feeling too small. You can't be serious," he stammered. Celia nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I lost a son many years ago. You bear the birthmark he had." Gregory shook his head, disbelief etched on his face. This is too much. I need time to think." He stood abruptly, avoiding her gaze as he rushed out of the room. Celia watched him go, her heart breaking. "Please," she whispered, hoping he'd come to accept the truth. Desperate for clarity, Gregory visited his adoptive parents, Richard and Vivian, that evening. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice tight, "was I adopted?" Vivian exchanged a troubled glance with Richard. She sighed, nodding slowly. "Yes, Gregory. We adopted you when you were a baby." Gregory's world tilted as he pieced together the truth. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, pain and betrayal evident in his tone. "We wanted to protect you," Richard said softly. Gregory left, feeling lost and unsure of who he really was. Mariah had overheard Gregory's conversation with his parents, and fury boiled within her. She cornered him as he returned, her voice low and biting. "So, your maid claims to be your mother? And now your real family is at stake?" Gregory glared at her. "Mariah, this isn't about you. This is my life, my past." But Mariah's fear of losing control drove her to lash out. "You think that woman's your mother? She's a stranger, Gregory. Don't throw everything away for her." He shook his head, frustration simmering. "I need to figure this out. Alone." Gregory met Celia the next day, his emotions a swirling storm. "Tell me everything," he said, sitting across from her. Celia nodded, her hands folded tightly. "I lost you when you were just a baby. I searched, but you vanished. Then, I came here and I saw you. So much like the son I lost." Gregory was silent, processing her words. "I don't know how to feel," he admitted, torn between the love for his adoptive family and this new, intense connection with Celia. She reached out, her voice soft. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." Mariah's eyes narrowed as she confronted Gregory in his office. "So, this maid claims to be your mother, and you just accept it?" Gregory met her gaze, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Mariah, this isn't about her claim. It's about my life, my past." Mariah scoffed, folding her arms. "She's trying to ruin everything we built." Gregory shook his head, exhausted. "I need to know who I am, Mariah. This is not about us. It's about my identity." He turned away, leaving Mariah fuming, her sense of control slipping. Gregory found himself spending more time with Celia, listening to her stories of hardship and resilience. "You never gave up, did you?" he asked softly, admiration evident in his voice. Celia smiled, her eyes warm. "I couldn't. Not when I thought you might still be out there, somewhere." Their bond grew as Gregory realized the depth of her love and determination. Mariah noticed their growing closeness from afar, jealousy and resentment swirling within her. She knew she had to do something, quickly, before everything unraveled. Desperation drove Mariah to plot a way to sever the bond between Gregory and Celia. She arranged a meeting with Richard and Vivian, Gregory's adoptive parents, spinning a tale of manipulation and deceit. "Celia has been influencing Gregory, trying to turn him against you," she whispered urgently. But Richard only shook his head. "Mariah, Perhaps it's time Gregory knows his roots. He deserves that. Mariah left, her plans foiled, her grip on the family slipping further. Fear crept into her heart as she felt her control wane. Inspired by Celia's strength, Gregory began reevaluating his own life. He'd built an empire, married the perfect woman, but for what? He looked at Celia, seeing her resilience, her strength, and wondered if he'd made choices based on expectations, not desires. I think I need to make some changes, he confessed to Celia one evening. She smiled, understanding in her gaze. Do what feels true to you, Gregory. That's all I ever wanted. Her words resonated, pushing him closer to confronting the truth he'd ignored for too long. Late that night, Celia and Gregory shared a heartfelt conversation, solidifying their bond. I want the world to know you're my mother, Gregory said, voice thick with emotion. Celia touched his hand, eyes shining. I'm here for you, Gregory. No matter what. They both knew this decision would change everything, especially for Mariah. But they were ready. Mariah, observing from the shadows, felt her world crumbling. She knew Gregory's public acknowledgement of Celia would be a blow she might not recover from, setting her on a final, desperate course. Gregory entered the living room, where Mariah waited, her gaze icy. Mariah, he began, his tone calm but resolute. I've decided. I'm acknowledging Celia as my mother, publicly and fully. Mariah's face paled, her carefully curated expression shattering. So you're choosing her over me? She spat. Gregory sighed. This isn't about choosing. It's about the truth. I can't ignore my past or my identity anymore. Mariah's voice wavered. You're throwing away everything we've built. He met her gaze steadily. No, I'm choosing to build something real. He turned, leaving her in stunned silence. Desperate, Mariah sought out Richard and Vivian, hoping they would persuade Gregory. This woman, she began, her tone frantic, she's manipulating him. Richard's expression softened with understanding, but he shook his head. Mariah, maybe it's time we stop trying to control Gregory's life. Vivian added gently, he deserves the truth. Celia is part of his story. Mariah's face fell as she realized she was alone in her resistance. Defeated, she left, the weight of rejection settling heavily on her shoulders. At a family gathering that evening, Gregory stood before the assembled guests, a rare vulnerability in his usually confident stance. Thank you all for being here, he began, his voice firm yet tinged with emotion. Tonight, I want to introduce someone who's always been part of my life, even when I didn't know it. My mother, Celia. He gestured for Celia to join him, and she stepped forward, her eyes shimmering with pride. Mariah, watching from a corner, clenched her fists, feeling the cold bite of isolation. Her world, once solid and controlled, now felt irreparably fractured. After the announcement, Mariah approached Celia, her expression subdued. Celia, she began, her voice strained. I'm sorry for how I treated you. Celia met her gaze with kindness. Everyone has their reasons, Mariah. What matters is what we do from here. Mariah's hardened facade softened, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. I didn't know, she whispered, guilt evident in her tone. Celia placed a hand on Mariah's shoulder. Forgiveness is a process. We all need it. The two women shared a tentative moment of understanding, opening a door to reconciliation. As the night drew to a close, Celia, Gregory, and the Whitaker family gathered in the quiet of the garden. The air was thick with a newfound peace as they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Gregory looked at Celia, warmth in his eyes. Thank you for everything, he said quietly. Celia smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. I'm proud of the man you've become, Gregory. They embraced, and as they stood under the stars, the Whitaker mansion, once a place of secrets and division, felt, at last, like a true home.